I just want to do God's will.
The kind of revolution that the world needs is a Christian revolution.
If you want a miracle, you've got to expect it to happen.
You are the recipients of God's grace and God's blessings, and you rejoice in that reality.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I'm Randy Robinson. Good to have you here. Today's guest has a book that just released, and it's one of the most frightening titles I have seen on a book in a while. The name of the book is Being Fully Known. Looks just like this. It's written by Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith. And I laugh when I say it, but if you think about it, being fully known is one of the most frightening concepts. And we'll get into it, but it leads to issues in a lot of ways. How do we overcome that? We're going to talk about that. Dr. Dalton-Smith, great to have you back on Life Today Live.
It is my pleasure to be here with you.
Now, am I alone in thinking that this idea of being fully known is a little bit scary?
You are not. I hear that quite often, and that's why we need to talk about it.
Well, how do you define it? Because, I mean, we all, acknowledge as Christians, oh, yeah, God knows us fully, loves us fully. We don't always act like it, and then with people, we, present ourselves, and there are some things that probably better left unsaid. What does this look like in a healthy way?
Yes. Well, I definitely agree that there's a spiritual identity component to it. And I feel like we spend quite a bit of time, particularly within the church, defining that aspect of it. But in my work with people within their businesses or even within their ministry, I find that sometimes when we see God shifting us in different ways, showing us parts of ourselves that we don't recognize yet, that maybe we have a gift we haven't decided to fully tap into, or some part of our personality that we haven't embraced, we have a tendency to get really stifled and sometimes even fearful because, well, I don't see myself that way. Or what will people think if they see me doing this other thing and I'm known for this? And so being fully known is allowing ourselves to get a fullness of our spiritual identity as well as a fullness of our natural expression of that identity on the earth. How is God using you to express his heart, his character, his desires, his plans, and not being limited by our traumas, by our expectations of other people, by our own people pleasing, not allowing those things to keep us boxed in?
Are you still practicing internal medicine, or are you full-time consulting?
I do consulting. I have a consulting business, and then I also still do nurse practitioner oversight. So It's hard to get away from medicine when you have a heart for it. Yeah. So still within medicine.
That keeps you busy. But in the consulting, I'm curious, what do you see when you go into workplaces? With this dynamic, what are you seeing?
It's interesting because we discussed my first book, Sacred Rest, on the 7 types of rest. Mm-hmm. That's primarily what brings me into the workplace. People wanting the burnout prevention. They want to know how to be sustainable within their careers. But then what I was finding is, as I kept hearing this message in my heart, there's a rest that yet remains. Because people would know how to put rest into practice, but then they were having the unrest of not allowing themselves to explore the other things that were on their heart. And so they were in this constant tension. And I see that with so many people. We hear people say things like, oh, they're having a midlife crisis when they change up and do something different. And usually that same person looks the happiest they've ever looked in their life because they've released the tension. They have come past that rest that yet remains, that rest of actually allowing yourself to fully reflect on how God is reflected within you.
I think if you ask people, are you to just sort of just stay the same your entire life? Most people would say, of course not. But yet this change, as you put it, this remolding, becoming, and then eventually belonging, that's harder for people to do than it is to just kind of acknowledge, isn't it?
It is, and it's really interesting because when we think about some of the heroes of the faith, the people who we look at their lives and we're like, wow, look at look at David. He went from being a shepherd to the king. Look at Joseph. He went through all the things, in his journey.
Yeah.
Esther. We have all of these heroes, and when we look at their lives, none of them stayed in the same thing that they started with. They all had this transformational experience where they had to learn who they were. And that's really where that subtitle, as you mentioned, comes from. Beholding is that spiritual rest, the opportunity for us to reflect on who God is, all of his characteristics, all of his personalities, so to speak, all of the names of God reflected so that we can stop and gaze upon them. And then not becoming more of something, but actually becoming more aware of how what we see in him is reflected also in us. And then the belonging part is really interesting because I find that oftentimes we are trying to find the places where we fit in. And that's not actually belonging. That's kind of just merging with the crowd. Belonging is like that puzzle piece. It has a specific, unique fit in the area. It may not fit in. It doesn't look identical to everything else, but it perfectly fits. And that's its own type of social rest, where you're not trying to fit in. You're trying to find the places where you complement the room, where you perfectly fit because you bring a unique expression, and your expression is unique because, well, I didn't live where you live. I didn't go to the school you went to. I didn't have the traumas or the dramas, or, each of us have our own uniqueness with that. And that's what we have to actually start finding.
That's very interesting because that says it's not about conformity, which is very much the way, groups tend to exert pressure, whether intentionally or not. It is this idea of conformity. What you're suggesting, a puzzle piece doesn't change its shape in order to fit properly. You're suggesting that we can be who we are in a positive sense. Obviously, there's some negatives that might need to go, but the positive things that God has built in our lives don't have to change in order to fit. That's an interesting revelation.
And when we step into that, when we allow ourselves to realize, I'm not going to do this the way this other person does it, but there's something about the unique way that I fit, that maybe it's the way that I say the words. It's going to I love using the puzzle example because my husband loves puzzles. We have like multiple ones in our house, and I'm not very good at puzzles. I get a piece and I'm like trying to force it to fit. It kind of fits, but not really. And he's like, that doesn't go there. And I'm like, but it kind of looks like it should. It's the same color. And then when you do find the right piece, there's no pressure that needs to be applied. It's like it falls into the place and settles there. That's what our lives should feel like. We should be stepping into places within our communities, within every aspect of culture, politics, medicine, art, whatever it is, and not trying to just see where does it feel comfortable and where does it, where do I look like everybody else and sound like everybody else? But where is the place where what my uniqueness, although it may have some edges and some different properties that are different than everyone else, it complements what's happening in that space.
That's very interesting. I think that's right on, and it is very, very counter to a lot of what we hear in the world today, unfortunately. But so there's another concept that you talk about some, and maybe you brought it up last time because I've heard this expression. We are human beings, not human doings. And you walk into any group of guys when we meet each other for the first time, we're like, hey, what do you do? It's like that's your identity, and part of that's conversation, and fine, I understand that. But how do we look at ourselves and not just focus on the busyness, the things we do, the things we accomplish, and build our identity around that, but go deeper and say, okay, who am I becoming? Who is God shaping me to be, and rest in that identity? I think that's a real challenge for a lot of people.
It is, and it's part of the reason why within the book I have every chapter ends with these what we call unveiling questions. It's this deeper reflection. I think a big part of it is us getting more comfortable with asking questions of ourselves and giving ourselves space to be able to think about, ponder upon, and meditate on those questions. Like, for example, I agree with you. A lot of networking events, it's like, hi, what do you do? I love now, especially places where that's the norm. I love asking questions that make people pause and they look at you like, what
Right.
did she just ask me?
Right.
Questions like, what's bringing you joy today? People pause in their track. I was on an event yesterday, a networking event, and I asked and it was a group of Christians. Otherwise, this question may not come off so easily. I asked the question, where are you seeing the evidence of God in your life?
Yeah.
And to see people's expression. Because what happens with that is I'm going beyond the doing that you do. It's who you are. It's the places that Holy Spirit is touching your life in such a way that you can't deny that God is real. And so I think that's a part of it. Getting to a place where we're not afraid to ask questions that touch our heart and make us have to actually think, well, what is bringing me joy?
Yeah. Well, that's good. All right. This is the book. It is Being Fully Known by Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith. She also hosts a podcast, by the way, and I'll throw up the website here in a second. It's the I Choose My Best Life podcast. And you can probably tell already by now that your best life is not centered around accolades and achievements, but about what Scripture calls conformity to the image of Christ, which is God's ultimate goal for all of us. But in this idea of being fully known, is that to ourselves, to God, to others, which scares me a little bit? How is this properly applied, do you think?
Yes. So with the beholding, it's being fully known with God. With the becoming, it's being fully known and reflecting upon yourself, the self-awareness, the allowing yourself the grace to explore and discover your gifts. With the belonging, it's allowing yourself to be known by others in the way that you represent God. It is not having to necessarily go beyond your level of vulnerability that you feel is unsafe. I think so. That I love that question because it's like, do I have to tell everybody all my secrets? Well, some of those things you probably need to work out with someone else first.
Right.
But it's being known in at the very kind of core of who you are as far as how you express God within the world. Because I fear that too many people have gifts that they know they have, but then they fear expressing because it doesn't look like someone else's gift, or they're not sure how it will be perceived by the people in their circle. Sometimes I hear people say, what will people think if they see me trying to do art and I've never done art before? Well, Grandma Moses started art at 77. She's famous for her art. What will people think when they see you being free, doing what God has given you a gift to do? I think they will think, wow.
Yeah. Well, at least they'll think they're trying art. What's the worst they could think? Even if they go, yeah, I wouldn't buy it, but you know what? And maybe I wouldn't sell it.
Wow, they're being bold. They're being courageous.
Sure.
They're stepping out, trying something.
Sure. So what are some of the barriers when it comes to that? Oh, by the way, on being fully known to others, you talk about vulnerability quite a bit, and there's also there's a fine line. There's a sense of propriety that I think is healthy, because we've probably all been around that person, especially in Christian environments where you come in and you're like, hey, how you doing? And they're like, well, and they just unload and you're just like, that's really not what I was asking. And they're just, I want to be authentic. And it's like, you got to have some discernment as to who you unload on and things like that. So yeah, working some things out before you get to the group.
Absolutely.
Real good idea. But one of the difficulties, and we hear this, we see it, social media amplifies it, and that's the comparison. And I know if people have been in churches, they're watching Christian TV or podcasts like this, they know they shouldn't, but it still seems to be pervasive, and it's not good.
Yeah, comparison is hard. And I think especially the way our culture's currently structured things with social media and with ratings and all of these different comparison marks that we now have that we can use. I think we have to take comparison kind of with a grain of salt in such that we can allow ourselves to see these rankings and comparisons, but rather than allowing them to define us, let them be celebration points. Because I think sometimes what we think that in the comparison we have to meet the same level or replicate what we just saw. When we switch our heart positioning to, can I celebrate what that person's doing? Can I celebrate what I'm seeing in that person that makes me want to compare?
Yeah.
And then rather than trying to conform, as you mentioned, to whatever they're doing, what are the elements? What are the things that I'm celebrating in them that are characteristics usually that I can bring into my way of doing it?
Yeah, that's really good. I like that. That's healthy. I mean, that's essentially what Paul was saying when he said, just do like I do. He wasn't saying compare yourself to me so that you can measure yourself by me. Not at all. He was saying that I have learned to emulate Christ in some ways that you can emulate too. So I like that. That's a really healthy perspective. All right. You've worked with people in this area. The book's new, so you probably hadn't gotten a lot of feedback on that yet, but the principles I know have been out there for a while. What do you see when people go through this process, allow themselves to really be known by God? They really do the self-awareness, self-examination, and they learn to fit in. What's sort of the benefit on the other side of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. This book came out of my coaching that I do with Christian women who feel like they're at that tension of becoming. They hear God calling them to be a writer or a speaker or an entrepreneur, which are all things I currently do. And hearing their stories and their journeys, seeing the tension points where I call it friendly fire, where the people you love most tell you it's a bad idea, you're going to get hurt, don't get disappointed. Working through all of those pieces of it, I love it to see someone come out on the other side. When all of a sudden they're like, look, I just got a book contract, or look, I'm not afraid anymore to stand in front of this audience at my church in this congregation and share my message or my testimony. And my favorite part of it is the multiplied fruit effect, because when one person really gets free from this kind of people-pleasing, conforming to the world type mindset and gets that boldness of Christ inside of them where they step out and speak truth, there's a multiplied effect. And those are my favorite stories. When they say, I shared whatever it is, or I wrote the book or gave the talk, and someone came up to me and said, that's exactly what I needed. That's exactly what I needed to stay in my marriage. That's exactly what I needed to not commit suicide tonight. That's exactly what I needed to take my next step of faith. That's what it's all about, isn't it? That makes it all worth it.
And I think those are just little gifts from God sometimes. If we don't live by those, and if we don't get those, you rest in the obedience. But when you get that, I think God's just going, it's just like a little thumbs up, like on a message. He's like, bing, like.
I love that.
Okay, right. But here's a tough question, and I don't know if you go into it in this book, but I mean, it happens all the time. When we step out, and when we try something, maybe we try to start a business, or we speak and we don't do very well. When our business fails. What do we do with failure? Do we fight through it always, or do we change course a little bit? Do we re-examine? What do you? I know there's probably not one answer because each case is individual, but generally, should failure be a redirect or a roadblock, or just something we're going to have to fight through?
I love that you asked that question, and I do talk about it in the book because it's very real. Yeah. I feel like I look at it this way. Every opportunity to have a rest has rest stops in it. And so failure is an opportunity to have a rest stop. One of the things I talk about in the book are called abide, act framework. It's a framework that I teach people regarding not always thinking just because something's working or not working, that you should just keep pushing. We need to have periodic points where we actually stop and abide. We seek God's heart around a matter. We seek Holy Spirit guidance about next steps, even before we get in trouble or need the next step. Just having a pattern of returning to the vine on a regular basis to make sure that we are rightly aligned. And so when we look at failure, failure is just information. We have to take our identity out of the act. Sometimes the obedience in itself is the lesson.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's being able to get to that point where it's like, well, I thought 10,000 people were going to, like that post or whatever,
Right.
or whatever it is that you're doing, or buy my thing, and only 200 bought it. But if God asked you to do it, he didn't say that you were going to get 10,000 or 2,000 or what all of these other things was. It was a request. And we have to sometimes first see the success in our yes. I successfully said yes to God. And when we do that, we really have to get to a place where we leave our expectations kind of surrendered.
Yeah, that's so good. And, I actually did that very recently with this online thing, doing it every day, because it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. We don't, a lot of the social medias are pay to play. You have to boost to get seen
yes.
and things like that, right? And people don't always realize that. We don't light it up and get thousands and tens of thousands of views. And, it's like, am I wasting my time, Lord, kind of deal? And there have been other side benefits that are not seen reflected in numbers, relationships. I mean, for me, it's like going to seminary every day and learning from people like you. So I've had a lot of personal benefit. It's helped our broadcast show too. But the revelation that, I knew this, but it was kind of like God brought it back, and it was like, when I talk to someone like you, if it impacts one person out there and changes the course of their life and brings them closer to God or brings them to God, is that not worth it?
It's all worth it. That's exactly right. Jesus went after the one. And so whenever I get caught up on numbers, and I'm like you, I'm a person who spends a lot of time doing things that have metrics attached to them. And so, my personality is one that is kind of hardwired to the metrics. I like data. I'm science kind of minded. I constantly have to remind it that I am celebrating my yes, not celebrating the metric.
Oh, that's good. I'm going to hang on to that, because the obedience is the biggest thing.
It is.
And whether nobody acknowledges it or sees it, or the whole world acknowledges it, sees it, it's the obedience metric to God. That's the one we have to stick to. Oh, that's good.
And I think that helps us actually not to take the glory for ourselves.
Yeah, right.
So that when it does happen, you're like, well, I had nothing to do with that.
Right. Oh, very encouraging. And I love this whole process. I would just encourage people to pick up the book wherever you get books. But I think this is the way we should view ourselves. This is the way we should view the world. And the world doesn't look at it that way. But it's God's economy is not the world's economy. And we really have to step into it. And that's what I see you talking about. All right, last word to you. Let me show people your website real quick while you ponder your final thoughts here. DrDalton-Smith.com is the website. You can go there. You can get to her books, her I Choose My Best Life podcast, other resources there. So if you want to follow up with her, I would encourage you to do that. But last word for someone who's stuck through this conversation and it's got them kind of thinking, what do you want them to walk away with?
I want them to walk away with the hunger just to behold him, because I feel like the more we allow ourselves time to behold God, not aspects of God we know, but the parts of God that are being awakened to us and the alive word that is before us. The more we behold him, the more we become what we behold, and we will stop trying to fit in and find the places where we are uniquely needed and fit.
So true. So good. Thank you for that, Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith. Appreciate you. Appreciate the work that you do. And we'll have to do this again sometime. Write another
Yeah.
book. We don't have to have a book if you want to do it, but write another book, and that'll put it in front of me, because the PR people are always like, have this person on. I saw your name and I was like, yes. I don't know what the book is, but yes, let's bring her on.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. Appreciate you guys watching. You want to encourage somebody, hit that share button. And if you haven't liked, follow, or subscribe, please do that. I mean, yeah, it helps the numbers, but you'll get notifications of other inspirational, insightful interviews just like this one today. Check out Being Fully Known wherever you get books, and we will see you again next time here on Life Today Live.
Nobody can prevent you from doing the will of God.